There's a place He comes to me. Though I'm blind, He helps me see. Though I see dimly in this place, one day I'll see Him face to face.
This is Kurt Kaikkonen, pastor of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, at your neighborhood church. Today on Face to Face, we'll be in the book of Revelation. So grab your Bibles and let's get started. If you want to hear this complete message in its entirety, go to yourneighborhoodchurch.com, where you can download Your Neighborhood Church app at the App Store. All right. So now Jesus, He addresses the pastor of Pergamos, and to these people, Jesus, He's identifying Himself as a warrior because that's how He's going to come to them. He's the one who has a sharp two-edged sword, and that's that long sword that's mentioned in chapter 1 for doing battle. And again, Jesus, He tells these guys, He says, He knows their works. And then He also tells them that He knows where they dwell. And He says that they dwell where Satan's throne is. And now it kind of seems like it'd be kind of a terrible thing to say about your city. And, you might think something like, shouldn't Satan's throne be somewhere like Rome or maybe Babylon, or maybe it should be in San Francisco or Washington, D.C.? But clearly here, Satan's throne is not in hell like a lot of people think it is. But at this time, it's in Pergamos. And you will find on the top of that hill in Pergamos that they had a temple to Zeus. And it could be seen from 50 miles away. And it was built, and it looked like a throne. And it was also one of the 7 great wonders of the ancient world. And then now Jesus, He comes and He says something good about this church in Pergamos, where He says that during the days of Antipas, who Jesus calls His faithful martyr, and that word martyr there is the same word used for witness. It's the same word that was used in chapter 1 toward Jesus Himself, where it called Him a witness. It's the same word, martyr. And it says that they were faithful in those days of Antipas's days, and that they didn't deny Jesus' name. And Antipas here, it has nothing to do with Herod Antipas. The name Antipas, it only means against all. But there was never anything else written about this Antipas, and only church tradition tells us that he was killed by being thrown into a bronze bowl that was heated up. And then Jesus tells what He has against this church. And the first thing is that there are some of them that are hanging around them that hold the doctrine of Balaam. All right, so you can read about Balaam in the book of Numbers, and it's in chapter 22, where this Balaam, he actually had a relationship with the real, true God. And this Balaam, he was a Gentile, and he had come from Babylon. But Balaam, he couldn't curse the nation of Israel for their enemies. But he did teach Israel's enemies how to entice them into sexual immorality, into idolatry to God, and so that God Himself would have to judge them. So Pergamos, they have some of these kind of people in their church, and they're compromising sexually. But you kind of have to realize that the whole city of Pergamos was sexually immoral because that's how they worship their God. So now this practice is being brought into the church, along with those people that hold the doctrines of the Nicolaitans, which were the same Nicolaitans the church of Ephesus rejected, where it says they hated their deeds. So now again, Jesus is saying that He hates their deeds again. But the people of Pergamos, what they did is they let these things into their church. And you remember how the name Nicolaitans means conquer the people? Well, Balaam's name, that also means Lord of the people. And so there's this whole argument about this being synonymous of Balaam and Nicolaitans, of this priesthood, and that it actually came from Babylon to Pergamos in 530 BC when Cyrus became king and everybody fled Babylon. So some people think that's why Satan's throne is there now, that it's now in Pergamos, but it used to be in Babylon. You can read about all that stuff because it's referred to in this book called The Story of Two Babylons. And in Jesus' rebuke here, He's not just rebuking those who are practicing sexual immorality or those who are believing in this false priesthood, but who He's rebuking are those who are allowing them to continue in their church.
Because you see, these people, even though they didn't compromise their beliefs by dropping that pinch of incense on the altar saying, Caesar is Lord, compromise has infiltrated their church. And there are now some practicing the same practices as all the pagans around them. And so now it's like you have this people in your congregation saying, well, we just have a few doctrinal differences than all the other Christian believers. And so they're tolerant and they're accepting these kind of doctrines into their church of immoral living. Now, it's not hard. We see that a lot today in our Christian churches. We see these same kind of things where they compromise with the world's values and they allow the world's practices. But you have to see this church at Pergamos, they actually believe the Bible. These guys, they believe it's true. They believe in the deity of Christ and they believe in salvation. They believe it all, but they only believe it all in their heads. But their leadership and their congregations, there's a big gap between what they believe and what they actually practice. And so there's a big danger of allowing these teachings and these practices of sexual immorality to be in our churches. And a lot of the churches say, well, it doesn't matter anymore. We've progressed. But the truth is, it matters to Jesus, and it mattered to him then, and it matters to him now. And so if you call yourself a Christian and you practice these sexual sins, and you think you're okay, and that your church is out of step with the times, and that your church should actually be more like you, well, it's kind of hard for me to say this because we're such a small little church, but you really shouldn't come here because you're bringing that kind of compromise into this church. And this is exactly what it's talking about here, right here in the Bible. We want people to come that are sinners, but we want them to come and to get saved and to have lives changed, not to just bring sins and bring it into the church. And so now the prescription Jesus has for this church is to repent, which means, again, to change your thinking, because Jesus says that if they don't do anything about this, that he will, and he'll come quickly and he'll deal with it. And he's talking about that sword of his mouth. And there's a lot of power in the sword of his mouth because that's a two-edged sword. It's a long sword. It cuts both ways. But he says to those who overcome, and it says to those who overcome. Well, that kind of tells you right there that not everybody who hears this message is going to overcome. But to those who do, they get hidden manna, which is that bread from heaven that gives spiritual life. Just like the regular manna, the physical manna gave physical life, this manna will give you spiritual life. And then he's going to give you a secret name. So you're going to have this intimacy of this name for you that only you and Jesus know. And then it says it's going to be written on this white stone. And a white stone back then meant a lot of things in the ancient world. One of the things it meant was to have admittance into an event. Sometimes it was the prize given to a gladiator when he won in the games. Here we have these three churches today. We have the church of Ephesus, which was the loveless church. And then we have Smyrna, which is the persecuted church, but the faithful church. And then we have this church of Pergamos, which is the compromised church. So I hope that your ears have heard everything they've needed to hear today. So I was going to do all four churches this week. That's just way too much. I was just really overconfident. But here last week, we started Jesus's 7 letters to the 7 churches in the book of Revelation. And we started with Ephesus, the loveless church. And then we traveled north up to Smyrna, the faithful but persecuted church. And then we ended up in Pergamos, the compromised church. And so there we had gone as far north as we could go. So now what we're going to do is we're going to head south in kind of a easterly direction. And so as I was thinking about studying these 7 churches, I got this idea that this is kind of like church hopping. Like we're on this bus and we're checking out all the Calvary chapels in the area. And I know that they weren't Calvary chapels, but these were real physical churches. And so we travel 30 miles south and we come to this small country church, Calvary Chapel, Thyatira. And Thyatira, it was the smallest and the least of all the 7 cities of all the 7 churches. And the historical writers at this time, writers like Pliny, he wrote and he dismissed the city of Thyatira as an unimportant city. But although they were the smallest of the cities, Jesus, he wrote them the longest message. And so Thyatira was a military city, and it was located on the Lycus River, and it had a temple to Apollos, the sun god. And the only one we know of who came from the city of Thyatira was Lydia. And she was a convert in Paul's ministry, and you find her in Acts 16. And she was a seller of purple because they made an exclusive purple dye in Thyatira, which was very expensive. And the strange thing about Thyatira, for being such a small city, the city had an unusually large amount of trade guilds. And trade guilds were like unions. You had to belong to a guild to work. If you don't belong to one, you don't work. And the problem for the Christians was that every trade guild was dedicated to at least one of the pagan deities, either from one of the Roman or the Greek gods. And so it was like every trade guild had its own mascot or like its own patron saint of that guild. And every type of work had its own guild. So there were guilds for leather workers. There were trade guilds for workers in linen. The potters had guilds. I think they were the Harry Potter guilds. And then they had the bakers. The bakers had a guild, and that was the I think the Jim and Tammy Faye guild. And then there were guilds for workers in bronze and for dyers of wool, and even slave traders. They had their own guilds. But the problem for the Christians was that these trade guilds, they were filled with morality, and they were also filled with idolatry. And every social event in the city of Thyatira was surrounded about the worship of these deities in these trade guilds. But there was a lot of economic and social pressure for these Christians to participate in these trade guild meetings. And the way that these meetings would begin, they would begin with usually like a wine offering that would be poured out to the pagan god of that guild. And then they would share a meal. And the meat at that meal would have been sacrificed to the god of that guild. And then everybody would end up drinking until they were drunk. And then the evening would turn into a night of debauchery, like a dirty little adult party filled with sexual immorality. And the Christians, they couldn't participate in these activities without compromising their faithfulness to Jesus. And so now Jesus, he has this message to the pastor at Thyatira. And first of all, he describes himself in his deity as the Son of God. This is the only time in the Bible where Jesus calls himself the Son of God. And then Jesus says, who has eyes like a flame of fire. And so here's that description from chapter 1, which means he sees all with the idea of having this penetrating judgment, and his feet like fine brass, which was the strongest known metal at that time. And brass, it always symbolized the metal of judgment. And you see that like at the temple, the bronze altar, and then there was that bronze snake that Moses held up in the wilderness. So bronze was always the metal of judgment when God judged Israel. So Jesus, he's standing firm there with his feet planted in this judgment with his church. And so he's going to be unmovable in this. And then Jesus tells them that he knows their works. And so Jesus, he knows the works of this small, insignificant church. And then Jesus says all these great things about them.
You've been listening to Face to Face. Face to Face on this radio station has been provided by Your Neighborhood Church. If you want to help support Face to Face and put this program on other stations just like yours, you can contact us at yourneighborhoodchurch.com or write Your Neighborhood Church, P.O. Box 500, Romeo, Michigan 48065.
There's a place he comes to me. Though I'm blind, he helps me see. Though I see dimly in this place, one day I'll see him face to face.
Tune in again tomorrow at this same time as we continue to go through the Bible.